a lot more creatives to begin the process with, rather than, it's normally just me and a director for the first like sort of 4 or 5 months before then, you know, a lighting designer or a sound designer gets involved. It was kind of all in at the beginning. And I think with this one, the thing that was really massive was the locations. You know, we kind of go all around Scotland. We end up in a sea, you know, we do the full circuit and come back. And of course, immediately you go, how do I represent those things, was my first thought whilst reading the script. And that becomes sort of like using the problems as a starting point for design, I think is quite often the way that I think about it. So in the initial conversations, we knew, right, it has to be really light on its feet. We have to let the actors bring us to these places because we're never going to be able to change the scenes this many times. We're never going to be able to get those locations. So we need to make it quite adaptable. Yeah, light on its feet, so it can take us places. The storytelling can take us to those places rather than me sort of visually trying to do that. If it's an adaptation or if it's from a classic, I like to understand the point at the time of when it was written, so the history of that. Why we're doing it now is also an important kind of understanding in the design language. With Isabel's writing, you know, it's an old classic, but the way she's written it isn't an old classic. So I knew I had to draw a reference to a kind of very kind of classical Scottish, I sort of describe it as like a shortbread tin image of Scotland, you know, this sort of idyllic landscape. But also like, how else do I hold Isabel's humour and the songs? And so it almost had to go somewhere a bit more kitsch. It was finding a fine line between this very traditional Scotland with this kind of kitsch language, so we could take people with the writing to all these new places. Nothing would be too much of a surprise if we kind of cross the languages over, but then also we can drop into serious if we need to, and then still allow the comedy aspect to kind of continue as well. So like a sheep on wheels goes past, and then the pirates are all 80s dressed, but then there's this really kind of solid love scene as well. Like, we can still hit that because we've kind of done the languages the right way. Poor theatre language as well. And in that sense, like, it sounds like it's giving something a bad name, but actually poor theatre is using one object and using it as creatively and as much as possible. So it doesn't just become the one chair in that scene, it becomes a table in the next scene, or it becomes the edge of a boat in another scene, or it's about reusing, utilising. And I think that using that skill and that technique then allows the storytelling to kind of breathe a bit more, because we get used to a language that's been set up. And I think with Isabel's story, you change so quickly between places that you don't want to keep getting too surprised by aesthetic choices or things that, you know, take you out of that place. You've got to really stay with the story. So the likes of, you know, the blue ladders that keep appearing in the piece, you know, getting them into the rehearsal space day one and seeing how many times we can reuse them, what needs to be adapted to it so we can keep reusing them. You know, in the beautiful love scene, there's a blossom tree that's on them, but they're also used as like the ship sort of lookout point as well. Yeah, there's lots of different languages that cross over. You know, we went through the piece and we were like, okay, so poor theatre here, magic theatre here. And I mean, I don't think that's a term, but we kept doing it because we knew that although we wanted this sort of utilised language, there was also points where like we just had to have magic that broke all the boundaries. And I think, again, that's that kind of idea of like a traditional Scotland with quite a kitsch Scotland. You know, it's something about the contrasts when they hit each other. That's when I think like something really exciting happens. I think that knowing that it had to tour, we had to stay within the Green Handbook, so we had to keep things within a small kind of footprint. I think the oval floor can tour really well. I think if you have a straight floor or lines, then that starts feeling like it doesn't quite belong in some of the bigger spaces because it feels more kind of cut out. You start kind of replicating the front of a stage. Whereas when we kind of started looking at this oval floor, it could sit almost anywhere in the stage, and like as close to the stage or the audience as possible, or really far back. And it didn't feel awkward. So it helped us out quite a lot in a lot of the spaces. But then it didn't feel too wrong when the actors stood on the black stage floor around it. So although we had like most of the, all of the important kind of acting happening on this wooden floor, a lot of the music was played on the black stage floor, and it still held its own, it still held a language, whereas I think when you're touring and you have a very kind of structured set, it can quite often feel quite heavy in spaces, or it can overpower it or feel lost, or it was about trying to find something that could hold the space but give as much space as possible as well. So having this kind of goalposts as well with the backdrops, that would just hold like all the audience's eye as well in perspective. It was just so open for sightlines as well. I think that was also a really important thing. You're going to all these different venues where you've got quite a lot of side seating, you've got audience quite up high, so it's constantly thinking about like if somebody's below, what are they seeing, and somebody's above, what are they seeing down, and that kind of the goalposts were just at the right space where, it kind of just held the space and didn't obscure anything. But I'm quite interested in that as well, like how you design for a space. I think like I enjoy that. I enjoy looking at like quite site-specific things. So figuring out how best the space speaks with something in it. We had this beautiful floor. We took the wooden floor from the idea of the Grand Old Opry, which is kind of country feeling. So we kind of took this wooden stained floor for that language. And we are faced with a red, really old style kind of cabaret curtain when it opens, and we've got the words kidnapped at the bottom. The design was about like unapologetically saying, you're here to hear a story and I am the narrator and I'm going to bring you through. So the backdrops almost started becoming like pages of a book. So the first one being kidnapped was our front page. And then this giant rock comes on. At the beginning, it just looks like kind of three-dimensional rock, and then there's a point where it turns round and we have a whole band in there. MJ just went, well, we need a drummer, but we don't want to put him in one place all the time. What if he's inside the rock? And we always just it was just an amazing moment, And that's the thing with the collaboration, like, you'd never really get to these places individually because you're too busy going, well, what does a giant rock look like on a stage? And then somebody's going, oh, we should have a band in it, and then just immediately it starts taking a collaborative form, and it's fantastic. We then move into the borders, and we have a big landscape of Scotland, and that landscape, that's the backdrop we use mostly throughout the production. So they're the main things. This floor, we've got, I think there was about 5 or 6 backdrops in the end, and then this big rock. Everything else kind of comes on and off. It's smaller props. We've got everything, like the ladders do stay there for quite a while. They become different points. They give us a lot of height to play with, which is really helpful. In the love scene, they had to climb up a tree. And, when you're reading that and going, well, what is this tree? How do we get it on the stage, and how do they climb up it? So immediately you have to start being really creative. And the ship was a tricky one. We knew we had the ladders and we needed ship paraphernalia. So we got that in the room, but we also, at the point of designing, didn't really know who was going to be playing music then. So we didn't know how many hands we would have free to make things or to bring things in and out. So that one was very much built in the room. We had a really good production manager. He was really good at sourcing, basically we made a list of everything that would be helpful in the room before we start rehearsals, so we could do this utilising language for theatre, reuse. Yeah, he got a connection from think it was somebody in Outlander that had just done this massive photo shoot with a ship, and they said, do we want all the stuff from it? So we were like, yes, it's exactly what we want. So at one point we had this massive ship, but then of course we couldn't get that on and off the stage, and it was bigger than our stage floor anyway. So we ended up just taking all the masts off it and all the fabric off it. So we got things in the room so that they could build it once they knew what hands they had, who was going to be playing music, and how we land going into that world. With the likes of the house, it definitely felt like we had to that was a real change in, like, we weren't so much in a landscape anymore. We had to really land this sort of grandeur, but it was grandeur but also not looked after, and it was falling apart. You know, I quite often do that thing like, what is the least amount of things you can bring in to make it feel like you're in that place? So at first it was like, is it doors or is it, and then we kind of went to this window idea, and at one point it was these 3 massive windows quite far back. So we would have like the depth of the stage to make it feel grand, but they would be battered or old, and then that kind of ended up turning into one window and a chair. And then amazingly, you know, lighting can do so much more to that tone as well. So they make it very cold and empty feeling. And likes with Clooney's as well, like we're like, what's the, you know, the 1 or 2 things that we can say, right, we're underground in a casino. So getting the big Clooney's writing and kind of lights, that had to be like quite an early decision as well for the make process. The Green Handbook is trying to think responsibly about our footprint in theatre and about wastage and usage. So there's 3 stages in the Green Handbook. There's like the sort of the base that everybody wants to be hitting within the next few years, and then there's the kind of middle one. So we were doing the middle one. So I think we were using it as a bit of a trial to see if it was feasible. I've done a couple of projects with the Green Handbook in mind as well, so it didn't feel like I was coming to it completely from scratch. I think what was really helpful is that when we started the process, there was a big discussion with me and the directors about like whether we could hit this and whether that like we're collectively wanting to do that together. And I think that felt really helpful in order, like, for us all to know where we stood with it, and that it was something that we all wanted to do together rather than something just the designer has to kind of troubleshoot. And they were really, the directors were really helpful and supportive, and if there were things that we couldn't quite manage because of it, they were really understanding. So I always quite often try to make the trouble things the start of the design anyway. So we already knew it was a huge cast going to all these different locations that had to be really light on its feet. So I knew it wasn't going to be a massive build anyway. There was one point I got very stuck on this ship because it was free, and it was a reuse, and I was like, this is amazing, until, you know, the head of production here, Gemma, was like, you know, you don't have to use the ship just because it's free. And that actually freed me up a little bit, because it sort of, yeah, you can get a little bit into these things, but again, that's why you're working with so many different people. You're all doing it collectively. I think the big thing for us was about getting as much in the room as possible. We knew the way that the directors wanted to work, and we knew that that wasn't going to be quick in terms of sourcing if we're having to keep to the Green Handbook. So we filled the room with, you know, we went to all the different theatre stores in Scotland and borrowed lots of things. At first they were stand-ins, so then if they got used, then we could either buy them off them, or we could replicate them if we needed to. And that was really successful, actually. And then there was a lot of things that we kept from there, or bought off the theatres that we borrowed them, or there's a really good relationship in Scotland now that's happening, and, you know, there's a lot of swapping going on anyway. I think the real problems for me that I found difficult were like greenery. I mean, on stage anyway, it's quite difficult to do outdoors kind of grass or trees or foliage. I think they're always quite a difficult thing to get depending on the tone of the piece. And in some of the scenes, they could be really plasticky and silly and kitsch, and they were fine, but there was some points where, like the love scene, where that had to be really sensitive and that had to be quite beautiful. And like we said, they camp under this tree and then they climb up this tree. And this tree was just like, it was such an annoyance for such a long time because I just couldn't figure out what this was, or, is it something that we make? We can't buy anything. And then our production manager, Gavin, just brought loads of twigs in from home. Like he'd cut down a tree in his back garden and just brought all those in. And then I started like taping them together, and then we started putting them on the ladders because they were like, well, can they use the ladders to climb up and pretend they're in the tree? We've got that language now. And then there was all this old foliage lying around that we'd taken from like every place in Scotland, because we couldn't buy new plastic flowers. They had this little yellow flower all over them. So I pulled off all these yellow flowers and put them on all these twigs. This took me about a whole day, but that's how we made the blossom tree. So it's it's a mix of, it's real big branches, and then these old kind of yellow flowers are stuck onto these branches. And then the foliage in that scene as well, it's all dried foliage. It couldn't be plastic, we couldn't buy new things. But then they're much more delicate for touring. So then we've got to keep an eye out on how they're handled and if they're going to last the tour. So I think foliage was the hardest impact. And it's a play based in Scotland, so you're going to have foliage. And then obviously the end scene where, the last curtain goes down, and in my head it was like a sea of heather that we'd see at the back. But then of course, in most of the venues, you're lucky if you've got half a metre behind that point anyway. So it was like 2 rows of heather. And this was all the foliage that we'd collected for months, and we'd handed it to a scenic painter with some references going, is there any way you can make this look like heather? It was bits of Christmas tree. It was like so many random bits of plastic, really old things as well. And she did an amazing job of like making this look like heather as well. So yes, in a way, it's quite exciting because there's a lot more people you need to, like labour time that you need for hitting the Green Handbook. Like there's a lot more scenic help you need. There's a lot more carpenters. A lot of the signposts we reused, but we had to change them slightly so they'd point different ways or say different things. Money's going more to people and less on things like that we don't need or wastage. So in a way, it's kind of the ideal, but it just does take just that little bit longer and a little bit more of a creative head. I think it takes people by surprise that there's over 70 costumes in the piece, because I just don't think you're expecting it because it's so smooth and they deal with it so easily. The cast were wonderful. We do this thing where it's called writing their tracks. So you take one character and then you see who they are at that point. Then if they go off stage, and then you have to know why they're going off stage. Is it to play an instrument, or is it to change a scene, or do I have time to get them into a new costume? So you do that all the way through the play, which I think took me and the costume supervisor good like 2 days to figure out, because it's so intense. And then from that, I drew up each of the actors' tracks, so they were aware like what their costume routes would be from character to character. And again, sort of trying to stick to the green card as well. A lot of this is like dependent on what we can get our hands on. So we didn't want to just go out and buy lots of things from the high street. It's about using other theatre stores. So the tracks that I'm drawing up is kind of like a wish list, and it's also as simple as I can do it, so I don't design too heavily and then we can't find anything that fits into what it is I really want to do. And so then on their first costume fitting, I would go through their tracks with them one-to-one rather than kind of doing it in the room. And they were really good at bearing that in mind. So when they were in a piece and then went off, and everything was on the rehearsal wall as well, so they could go over and refer to things. There was a few things they'd then come back to me and then go, Anna, I get pulled across the floor at that point, so my jacket with all the feathers all over it isn't going to last. And so, right, okay. So then I'd discuss with EJ, with movement, or with the costume supervisor, and discuss right, how can we change this or troubleshoot it together. I think I was really impressed at how well they managed to keep referring back to the costume and keeping that in mind for going throughout the piece. I mean, still with that in mind, we'd first dress runs tech, and even the first few previews, you'd go backstage, and at the interval, there's two quick dressers at either side of the stage, and they're just in front of this pile of clothes that is up to their arms. Everyone just comes off and just throws everything, because then they've got to get out. But by the end of the run, it was so simple. They could do it. Things would be back on the hangers, and we tried so hard to can she just wear a hat and a scarf? And if she could, or he could, then we would go with that language. But there was just quite a few of them that just needed that little bit extra as well. And all I ever knew on the